I know it's after lunch, you've just eaten, and so there's a tendency to be a bit sleepy, but given the two rock stars I have here with me, I suspect you will soon wake up. Thank you for joining us. Lola has done such a good job of introducing them. Tejo Cole is on my right, and Helen Habila is on my left, so I'm not going to say much more than to tell you about the names of the books that we're going to be talking about. Helen Habila has written a story about the Chibok abductions, and it's called The Chibok Girls. And Tejo's book is a collection of essays which is so varied and wide that he talks about everything from Chibok to photography, to lynchings, to Black Lives Matter, to the issue of race identity. The whole gamut is covered by this collection of essays. I always accuse Lola of giving me the most difficult conversations to handle because, trying to have a conversation with someone who's written one book and is on one issue and then someone who's written, but we're going to try and do that. And I think it's important that people get to chip in, so I will give at least 25 minutes to the audience, for a back and forth. Okay, so let's start, and I'd like to start with the area of commonality between your two works, starting with you, Tejo. Your story, Captivity, is essentially about the abduction of the Chibok girls, but unlike maybe a lot of the other essays in your book, is quite short. Not only is it short, it doesn't dwell too much on context and history and the nuances that you're known for when you're writing about subjects. We don't see you reaching out to philosophers, to history, to give this story the grounding that perhaps a few of your other stories have. Why is that?
Thank you very much for the warm welcome. It's very nice to be speaking to this audience. It's always different when you're home. There's always a kind of irreducible generosity about the kind of encounters you have with people who have this much in common with you. So, Lola, thank you for organizing another amazing festival. It's a pleasure to be back. And, I'm thanking Lola because I'm always giving her shit. I feel like with her I can be a bit of a diva. With other organizers of festivals, I have to be on my best behavior. And it's an honor to be on stage with Helen, who is my traveling companion. We have encountered each other in several continents by this point, so it's always a great pleasure. So, to the matter at hand, Helen's written a book about something that I wrote like 2.5 pages about. I've got this very, very short essay. Around the time that the Chibok girls were abducted, well, that was a fascinating time because overnight, everybody on social media became an expert on Nigeria, which was fascinating for those of us who were Nigerians. Like, oh, didn't know you knew so much. And of course, nobody knew anything. But we live in the age of politicized opinion standing in for actual knowledge. Everybody had very strong feelings about something they knew nothing about. And everybody had a sense of very simple solutions to what was going on. So a hashtag that had begun as a kind of grassroots effort to hold the government to account sort of went global and international, bring back our girls, and became yet another banal marker of coolness and wokeness, but not connecting to anything on the ground. Anyway, it was in this sort of hothouse environment that, as a Nigerian writer living in the United States, and at that point I was already writing pretty regularly for the New Yorker, so they asked me to write a piece about the Chibok girls, a kind of a familiar gesture, here's an expert, here's somebody who knows the country, let's ask him for his informed take. And so what I decided to do was write an anti-essay, actually. An essay that was basically about the limits of what could reasonably be said about something that was so complicated and so grievous. Because precisely what I had missed in all the commentary was any sense of the grief and the extremity of what had happened. It was just another, it seemed to have become just another matrix for white saviors to opine or to swoop in and solve the problem. Obviously, the problem is not solved.
But then if that was the case, in writing it, one would have thought one would see an attempt, therefore, on your part to sort of go beyond the obvious, to look at not the information that is out there. And yet, when I read your essay, actually, there wasn't anything that, was written that I thought you could not have found elsewhere, with the little exception that perhaps you put, voices to the girls. You sort of imagine what they would be going through and that sort of thing. So how do you talk about an anti-essay when actually what you did was quite actually simple in many ways?
Not at all cynical, actually. It was a kind of recognition of the limit of opinion formation, of throwing an opinion out there in order to just sound as if you know what's going on. But the reality is, even though I had done some limited travel in northern Nigeria, I hadn't been to Maiduguri, hadn't been to Chibok, and I wanted to say, there's all of this activity going on, social media and politics, but the one place we want to be inside this girl's experiences, is the one place we cannot go. So it wasn't cynical, it was saying, unlike Hilon, I hadn't been there, he had been there. If you go there, you can write a book about it. If you've not been there, I think the best you can do is to draw the perimeter around your own experience. And I think for that reason, the essay annoyed a lot of people. But I said, I'm not going to give you an opinion, I'm not going to tell you how to solve this problem. Okay. All I'm going to say is that it's complicated.
Right, and this complication is what you tried to grapple with, because you took the trouble. You went to Chibok, and the resultant book is what we get. Now, what I find interesting about your journey is, of course, you are from the Northeast. You are Christian, and so you have a lot of cultural and social similarities to some of the Chibok girls that were abducted. From that point of view, how did the abductions affect you? And how did they influence the decision to travel to Chibok and eventually write this book?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, people, for being here. Thank you for inviting me again, Lola. I like what he said about the limits, limits, just period, limits of opinion, limits of what you can say. For me, the limit was the limit of fiction, This is my first non-fiction book. Though I write essays, I write reviews and things like that, but this is the first time I told myself I was going to write a non-fiction book. So I was really specific about that because I saw fiction wouldn't cut it, There's a time when you want to say something, when you are compelled to say something directly without any ambiguity. So I had that feeling. I was actually in Germany at that time. I was spending 1 year in Germany, 2013, 2014. I was there to write a book, to work on a novel, and I just couldn't. Things were just happening in Nigeria. Every time you go to the TV, there's something. Not just in Nigeria, in my part of Nigeria. These are the places I grew up in, and they were happening. And so I was paralyzed. I stopped writing my novel that I was writing. And I didn't just want to write an essay in the paper. I didn't just want to, write something on Twitter. I wanted to do something more significant. So when I came back to America, I had the opportunity. I talked to my editor, who was so worried. Where's the novel? You went to Germany to write this novel. Where's the novel? I said, there's no novel. I'm going to write a non-fiction book. He said, yeah, but we have a contract. I said, I know. Push the contract aside. I have to do this book. So I was lucky to meet the people, Columbia Global Reporter. They made it possible for me to travel. Went to Chibok about 3 times, to talk to the people and all that. So, like you mentioned, the North is such a complex place. We talk about the Muslim North, Christian South. It's more complex than that. It's Nigeria. there are pockets, you know, of others, of difference here and there. So I'm one of those people who are northern but Christian, Hausa speaking but not Hausa, you know. So that's the mix, and I grew up in that comfortable time with my cousins who are Muslims, you know, and my uncles who are Muslims, but I'm Christian and all that. So just things kind of developed.
There's a section in the book which I thought was quite insightful, because it sort of speaks to this duality and multiplicity of identities that you talk about. Because again, in the beginning, Boko Haram tried to set neighbor against neighbor, deliberately targeting churches and Christians until, you know, it became a free-for-all. And you spoke about your experience growing up, where as a Christian child, you take a piece of chicken and take it to a malam.
To the malam,
so
to
that
slaughter
they
it,
will slaughter it, making it halal, so that your Muslim neighbors would be comfortable about coming to your house and actually eating.
Yeah, exactly.
And these were the relationships that existed, which people sometimes, when they look at the fault lines that now exist, don't realize they exist. How significant do you think that history is? And especially as we look to how to heal and move forward.
Yeah, I was trying to link that time, you know, that kind of idyllic moment in our history in the 70s after Odoji. Everybody was comfortable, there was money, people were not like tense. Because some of the drivers of the conflict is, you know, economical, political, and of course ideological as well. But to go back to what you said, that time, what I remember is how I live in this tenement house with the only Christian family, all the others were Muslims. And every Salah, you know, there will be these dishes of food, you know, that they will bring to us. And every Christmas, we'll also kind of send food to them. It was just like that. There was no mention of what religion you are. It's not very important, you know. But gradually, you begin to see the change, the fault lines begin to develop. How do we go back to healing? I don't know, but I think what this tragedy has done for us is that we cannot afford to continue in this way, you know. And there's a limit to what religion can do, you know. At the bottom line, we're all human beings. And I think that when you see a Christian being killed next to a Muslim, there was no distinction. There is no distinction between the victims. Basically, they just kill for killing's sake. So there is that realization, I think, we have reached that point where we have a commonality of interests, of self-preservation, and that's a starting point. You go from there. Basically, we want to oppose this thing that's killing us, whether we're Christians or Muslims.
Okay. Now, on the issue of religion, because again and again in this country, it's one of the biggest fault lines that we have, Tejo. We keep finding ourselves talking about religious violence that, you know, goes back many, many years. Your piece on aging actually grapples with the question of getting old through a movie that you watched, and the fact that it was so graphic and painful and forces you to confront some of these issues. The last page, and I want to read a little bit of what you wrote there because I think it's kind of relevant to the question I want to ask. I think I'm trying to find the page, just bear with me. Yeah.
Take your time.
Yes. And at the end of it, we see the main character that you talk about, you know, decrepit, old, and you end with a line that says, it's a glimpse of what will happen when it's all over, which is to say, nothing. In that one sentence, there seems to be a complete dismissal of the notion of life after death and the way religion, you know, seems to play a function in the way people live their lives and maybe the way they die. Would that be correct or not?
Now, that's what we know in the trade as a hard question. See how she just set me up? Almost anything I might say now would be a quotable quote. Let me see how I can wiggle out of that one.
Shall I ask another question?
No, no, no. I mean, of course, I want to grapple with it. It's a genuinely complicated question. And I think that in the present and for a very long time to come, a lot of people are still going to take aid and comfort in religious precepts that, on the face of it, are quite obviously contradictory to each other. I grew up in a family that has lots and lots of Christians and lots of Muslims, and our experience of daily life is one of pure, uncomplicated tolerance of each other. I mean, it's not even in question, we're family. But on a theological level, there's obvious contradiction. And those contradictions just sort of remain unresolved, right? But they cannot all be literally correct. And I think my personal answer to that question at the moment is that I don't know that any of them are correct, actually. You know, I mean, I don't see any evidence for it. However, I can say that and also understand that religious belief is something that is very close to people's lives and experiences. I would not seek to, abolish it, because I think a much more serious priority is on what bases can we get along? What are the bases on which to construct a society that actually includes believers of all kinds and people who are not sure about their belief and people who don't believe at all?
Now, there's rising conflict globally, and we find a bit like what's happening in the Northeast, where Boko Haram represented what a few people thought was a real alternative to the issues of marginalization, to the issue of bad governance. Where you live in the United States, for example, the far right increasingly also spouts out Christian rhetoric as a justification and a sort of, if you like, a battle cry for rallying the faithful.
Absolutely.
And it is in that context I'm wondering whether it is important that we begin to engage with religion, because again and again, it keeps being this tool that people want to use to either change things that are wrong or to dominate or to influence.
I suppose I wouldn't say that we need to engage with religion. I would just say I would like religion to stop engaging with us so much. I mean, we're the victims here. But having said that, I mean, I really think sometimes it can be easy to say religion is the cause of these, that is very much about defining in-group and out-group. But, if you see some guy walk into a place and blow himself up, it's easy to forget history and just think, oh, well, these guys are the absolute worst. Nothing this bad has ever happened before. But if you think about how many people Stalin managed to kill in a totalitarian situation, which was explicitly anti-religious, or how many people that Mao killed in the successive Chinese revolutions, you don't need to have religion as an excuse to kill 20 million of your own people.
Helen, in some ways you grapple with that issue on page 85 of your book, because you talk really about how ordinary people are capable of evil, so the banality of evil, to borrow the title from the famous book. You talk about this and say, in giving the example of Metasine, another leader of a cult who ended up leading to the death of many people before he himself and his followers were killed up, and who's, we still sort of see remnants of him flaring up from time to time. In that sense, therefore, in your travels inside Chibok, the humanity that is capable of becoming evil, how are the people sort of dealing with that? In that it's their neighbors, it's people they used to know, who are now committing all these atrocities against them.
Yeah, I guess that's the scariest aspect of this whole thing. Ordinary people just waking up and just turning into these monsters. And to go back to the Metis Ini reference, I remember we were just young kids in the 80s. And when that thing was happening, you know, it was like something that was something unimaginable. And then he was killed. I remember his picture was being sold on the streets. People were buying them. And you look at the picture thinking that you see some kind of two-headed monster, but it's just an ordinary person, this, you know, ordinary person with a bad eye. And this is the person that kind of inspired all this hatred and all this craziness. And then now we have it too, you know, with Mohammed Yusuf and Shekau and the whole Boko Haram thing. These are, when you see them, these are young people, small kids with guns, you know, their neighbors rising up, like you said, and killing neighbors. So it's banal, you know, it's also kind of scary that this thing is actually possible, you know, that this thing could happen in this country. We've never had, like you said, had suicide bombings before. And we never thought it was going to happen in Nigeria because we say Nigerians love life too much. No Nigerian will ever blow himself up, you know? Then a Nigerian actually did that. It was like, wow. Then you know that we have reached a point where there is a Nigeria before Boko Haram and a Nigeria after Boko Haram. We've like reached a divide. The country has really transformed and changed. And
if
basically,
we can engage with that just for a minute, and I'm happy, you know, for both of you to sort of comment on this.
Yeah.
This refusal, this denial that we seem to have been in a country where, despite the warnings, despite the fact that all the indices pointed to a country that was not quite right. You know, we saw things flaring up, dying. We knew institutions were not functioning. They were breaking down. We saw jungle justice on the streets, so we knew there was a degree of impunity. We realized that there was a disconnect between those who were governing and those they were governing. And yet, this Nigerian optimism that, you know, we sort of used to see as a very positive thing seems to have sort of blinded all of us to the coming of this evil, so to speak. How is that possible? Because it was something that was entirely predictable.
I mean, I wonder if Boko Haram itself was the arrival of the evil. Obviously it wasn't, right? You gave the example of Baitatsine and the things that had happened before. But also the kinds of drivers of this kind of theological, political violence, which is rooted not because somebody has decided to become a serious scholar of the holy texts. It never really begins with that. It begins with a perception of inequality and disregard that then becomes a movement that then takes its sustenance from theological ideas. We have this wonderful thing that is a country, right? It's an imagined community where we're trying to find the language for what it means for us all to be in one space together. But it's also kind of a curse because we can never quite address what we're dealing with sufficient seriousness. We never go to root cause, for example. If we know that inequality is a driver of this kind of extreme violence, and instead of dealing with inequality in a concrete way, why is there such extreme poverty in certain pockets of the North, for example? But what you decide to do is like, no, we're going to go in there and going to kill 500 of these guys. That'll solve it. That never solves it, because you kill 500 of them and then in a year there's going to be 5,000. You know, so for example, right now, as far as I can tell, we have a president who actually has not surrendered his authoritarian instincts yet. So what he's doing to the Shiites, you know, is you're like sowing the seed for something that 2 years from now you'll say, well, how did this happen? Well, I'll tell you how it happened. Like what's happening right now is there's no special trick to predicting the future because it's all present in the now.
Yeah, it's so easy to kind of look back, in hindsight, and say that this thing was happening, that we should have been able to predict this. I guess what you're asking is what could we have done differently, looking at what.
Or even if we've learned the lessons.
Yeah, even if we've learned anything.
And clearly, based on the Shiite example.
But the funny thing with history is that it repeats itself, And we look at this thing, and some people were not born when Metacine was happening, but we've had Metacine before. The same society, the same.
That's right.
North, And you look at that, you go back even further, before colonialism, we've had the jihad, that kind of Islamized the whole of the North. What is jihad? Jihadism basically is war,
not exactly.
Well, in that context,
Yeah.
Well, when you get to people and you invade them and you kill them to combat them, I call that war, yeah?
Yeah, so that's one version of it.
So that's one version of it. So that, but what I'm saying is that we've had that before, So you keep going back even further and further. There's always been this conflicts and all that. So it's not as if it's never happened before, We've had it. That's why you need democracy. You need some sort of idea that will make it possible for people to live in peace,
Okay.
And
let's talk about democracy in the United States, Teju.
It's painful though. I'm happy just talking about Boko Haram, really. Man.
Because, this, sometimes when we talk about Nigeria, it's almost as if we have the, if you like, monopoly on all the sort of things that are negative that go wrong. Your
I have
essay,
to say, the low-key
yes.
enjoyment that Nigerians are taking in the utter disaster happening in my other country, you people are not good, huh? Because...
Well, let me just ask you quickly about your essay on Alabama.
Yeah.
Where you look at the civil rights movement, you revisit Selma, you revisit Montgomery. In writing that essay, you quote a line from Coltrane in 1963, and you talk about unoffending, innocent, and beautiful, where the victims of one of the most vicious and tragic crimes ever perpetrated against humanity, referencing, of course, the Birmingham kids that were burnt in the church. And, of course, Chibok as well. These were young girls that were abducted. And you have a question there which says, how could humans?
Yeah.
Very, very pertinent question. And in light of the suggestion that perhaps there are systems and processes that somehow mitigate against this sort of inhumanity, but given the fact that America is a democracy, and this happened in the United States, I'm wondering whether that is the answer, or if it's a more complex issue.
Yeah, and I think Helon should also answer this. He also lives in the States.
I keep forgetting.
they've been living there longer than me, so.
Yeah. But you also cried on Tuesday, Sha. No? I mean, if we're going to take the idea of human equality seriously, we do have to understand that when some Nigerians act in a certain way, it's not simply because they are Nigerians. Obviously, it's not ethnicized or racialized. That there is something about humans that is reactive. Human beings are put into a situation and will act a certain way, except for a small handful of people who, even in difficult situations, find the wherewithal to rise above their circumstances. But most people will crumble in bad situations. I mean, when I'm at my most misanthropic state, which I admit is often, people are stupid. People are stupid. And because they're stupid is, if some malam says, go blow yourself up, they blow themselves up. And if some crazy fascist misogynist says, I'm going to make your country great again, they vote for him. This is rooted in human stupidity.
Isn't that a bit too reductionist?
No. People
People
really are stupid. However, if you create structures and institutions that prevent their stupidity from having a multiplier effect, then they actually look quite, ooh, they're great, And so you go to, Switzerland and nothing's on fire and nobody's blowing themselves up and nobody's electing fascists. It's not because the Swiss are, I've got some Swiss friends in the audience. It's not because the Swiss are smarter than we are. It's not because they're better people, but it's because they have institutions in place that actually prevent the multiplier effect of the worst, the reptilian brain, we call it, of humanity. So it is so very institutional. And when you have poor institutions, for example, the institutions of education in the US are actually very unequal and very poor. People go to the ballot box and they're not educated about anything. And so it becomes a mere popularity contest. Without education, democracy is meaningless.
Helen?
Yeah, exactly. I agree with that, yeah. And that's the problem with exporting democracy wholesale. You have America trying to export democracy. Democracy has to grow organically. People have to be educated. People have to know who is the better candidate to vote for. You cannot just do that without being educated, The best societies where democracy works are the most educated societies. That's the bottom line,
Okay,
It's not a coincidence.
Yeah, I want to open it up, but before I do, two final questions to the two of you, really regarding style. Forgive me for saying so, Tejo, but your book, if it was a conversation, you'd be accused of being a name dropper, because every other page, you're referencing a philosopher, you're referencing some piece of music, and we get to understand just how much you know as a person. And I'm wondering whether when you write, is because you have a particular audience in mind, in this case maybe the New York literati, or is it simply that you are at that space in time where you need to put these things down? And I say this in the context of your prefix to this book, where you talked about the fact that your writing for you is now an opportunity for you to just understand what you know, to engage with what you know, and to understand the limits of knowing. I think that was the quote. So it's in that context I'm asking this question.
Growing up, studying in Nigeria, going to school here, we had a few, shining examples of African literature, led, of course, by Achebe and Soyinka in this country, and then people like Ngugi wa Thiong'o. We're very honored to have you in the audience. Thank you. But for the majority of our education and our studies, writing is white, The libraries are full of books by white people. And learning to be literary, learning to have a literary life is something that is very much you're doing on your own and finding your own voice within that. I say that by way of preface in order to say that this is already a fraught activity for a black person actually to be doing on the world stage at all. And there can be the risk of being a shrinking violet about it, dialing yourself down. The world is ours, all of it. It belongs to us. Everything is interesting, It's not too complicated, it's not too complex. If I've put 7 layers in something, I want to go up there and put in an 8th layer, because why the hell not?
Don't you worry about detaching yourself from what people might consider your natural constituency?
This is my natural constituency,
hang on.
and my book has been selling out here.
Yeah. Beyond.
No. I think this is a very important point, because we can really underestimate people's intelligence.
Well, you just called people stupid a few minutes ago.
That's true. That's true. So, good point.
She got you
She
there.
got me there. But there are people, and then there are people. Obviously, we also know that this is a privileged audience in certain ways, but it's an audience that is privileged by its hunger not to be stupid. It is actually, I just want to make this point. It is actually true that there are people in the US, in Europe, and also in Nigeria who find the texts intricate. They find them complicated. But there's so many people here who are grateful for texts that rise up to their own level. My readers want me to be good enough for them. I'm not worried about them not understanding me. I want to make sure what I write honors their intelligence.
Now, Helen, you probably won't be happy as well about this question that you probably won't be happy as well about this question.
To hit him hard, though.
So, I got insights in reading your Chibok story. Like I said, because, you know, as someone who is situated and grew up in that general environment, there were things you could tell us about the place that maybe we didn't know. But beyond that, there wasn't much more in the book that wasn't out in the public domain. And because this is your area, and because this is your first work of nonfiction, I wondered why you perhaps didn't try harder to do a book that was a bit not as lightweight as maybe this is. Yeah, maybe with a bit more detail, a bit more rigor, a bit more depth.
Yeah.
Chai.
First of all, I reject the, the implications of the question. This is a precise thing. This is a precise book about a specific thing at a specific time about the Chibok girls. This is journalism. This is not like I'm not writing a philosophy book on Chibok or a history book. This journalism, this long-form essay, basically about this time and place. And I felt that I just didn't want to keep quiet, you know? I didn't want to write this book in reflection like 10 years from now. I wanted to do it at that time, at that moment. And I think as a writer, we're all called upon, to just say something, not to keep quiet. It doesn't have to be earth-shaking, philosophical essay about this thing that people hadn't heard before. I just wanted to say something. I just refused to keep quiet. That was it, yeah.
So thank you. Okay, I think there are a few things that they'd picked out from the books that you wanted to read. So if we could have 2 quick readings and then we open it up to the audience, yeah? Because I was told you have a few things you wanted to read from the books.
I'll find something. You can start.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, this is about my visit to Chibok. Ahead of us was the last checkpoint before Chibok. This was the most important checkpoint of all. The soldiers here would determine whether I got to enter Chibok or not. Vehicles coming in or going out were given a special pass, which they must present to the soldiers. Traders bringing supplies from neighboring towns must have an inventory listing every single item they carried. Since the kidnapping of over 276 schoolgirls in April 2014 and the subsequent media focus on the families of the kidnapped girls, the government had placed the town on lockdown. Journalists in particular were persona non grata. I was told of a British reporter who came as a guest of the wife of a local pastor and was turned back at this checkpoint. The Chibok native, Reverend Titus Pona, chairman of the Christian Association of Nigeria, Borno State chapter, had promised that the local pastor would wait for me at the checkpoint and take me in as his guest. When I got the pastor on the phone, he made excuses and said he couldn't meet me. Now my fate rested on the mood of the soldiers. Abbas, whose hometown, Lassa, was only about 30 minutes from Chibok, said he had lots of friends here and concocted a new story. We were coming from Lassa to visit his friends, one of whom had just gotten married. And there was a taciturn Michael of the JTF as back off if the new story failed. And so, once more, we got out of the car and approached the soldiers who were seated under a giant tamarind tree by the roadside. With them were 3 civilian JTF members with their Dane guns and knives tied on ropes around their waists. Michael identified himself and handed over his ID card. Next, Abbas handed over his driver's license and mentioned the name of his friend who were ostensibly visiting. The soldier gave a non-committal nod and turned to me. I handed over my state of Virginia driver's license. America, he said. I'm Nigerian, I said, but I live in America. Mr. Americana, he said. Actually, it's more like Nigeriana, I said. Not sure where this was going, but he seemed suddenly to relax. The other soldiers were laughing and echoing Americana. Now I noticed how young they were. None of them could have been over 25. They were just kids, sent here to fight a brutal enemy who relished capturing soldiers alive and slaughtering them like rams for propaganda videos. They were clustered around the one holding my driver's license, taking turns looking at it. The mood had lifted. So what do you do in Americana? I teach, I said. I'm a professor. Professor Americana. I laughed with them. Professor Americana, why not? He returned my license and waved us through.
Thank you very much.
Not so lightweight, huh?
This is called The Island, and it's about 2 pages. I'll read it in entirety. The Island. A clear day in the early 1980s, for example. A man drives past the harbor of the city in which he lives. He sees docked boats, restaurants, children at play, the island sleeping in the distance. Without quite meaning to, he remembers that the island is a prison. And then, as he is a man of some imagination, he imagines something worse, that people are tortured there. It has been going on for a while. Years pass. The rough sea of the crossing makes it feel far. The swells are huge. The ferry could sink like a stone. Our tour guide, used to it, sleeps on the journey. Soon, in less than half an hour, the ferry arrives. The prison is now a museum. There was and is a pitiful garden along a wall. A sunny afternoon, 1977. The torturers have arranged for some of the prisoners to be photographed. They lead them to an arid patch of land and give them shovels. The press is told, "This is a garden." A photographer takes a picture and captions it, "A prisoner working in the garden." The prisoner is not working. He stands erect, faces forward. He wears a floppy hat and dark glasses. When they let him go 13 years later, he will be unable to shed tears. The limestone quarry will have ruined his eyes. He is a contained fury. On the island, the tour guide mentions names. Each falls like a stroke of the cane. Sobukwe, Sisulu, Mbeki, Katrada. The names raise memories' welts. On the other side of the island that is surprisingly big, surprisingly wild, the waves break their heads against the rocks, repeatedly trying to forget. From time to time, we see ruined ships. 27 years later, the prisoner looks at the photograph. I remember that day. The authorities brought those people to prove that we were alive. Ambushed by memory, the prisoner becomes angry again. He begins to denounce one of the visitors from that day. A handler intervenes. "Kulu, great one, you know you can't talk like that." But he won't be corrected. "No, we must be honest about these things." The God of his youth is in his voice. Blacks are allowed in the company's gardens now. You can see them there with their families on a warm day. Things have changed. Near the gardens is a slave lodge. In the heart of the gardens is the monumental statue of Rhodes, his arm raised towards the rest of the continent. Cecil John Rhodes, 1853 to 1902, your hinterland is here. His gesture reads through history's lens like a Nazi salute. White supremacy has its uses because of its great care and its thoughtful strategy, because of the tireless way it hoards its hatred. It is good at making heroes. Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Desmond Tutu. What would our lives have meant without theirs? No wheel moves without friction. Without the obscenity of white supremacy to resist, they might have been mere happy family men. Nevertheless, whoever was tortured stays tortured. Torture is ineradicably burned into him, even when no clinically objective traces can be detected. The island migrates to other places and the torturers diversify, but the island is never far away. Occasionally, it leaps into the mind of a woman as she goes through her day during the 21st century. A man somewhere is jolted awake in the middle of the night by things he knows to be true. If the island's physical distance is a little greater now, its moral distance is not. Many, many years later, the prisoner finally dies. The torturers take a moment to praise him, to praise themselves, then they return to work.
Thank you very much. Okay, I would love to engage with that, but I think people want to ask questions. We may get a chance to discuss it later. Let's start maybe from the back and work our way forward. There's a young lady there. Okay, oh, not so. Oh, okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ayodele. My question is for Mr. Cole, Teju Cole. Hi.
Hi,
I heard everybody has been taking selfies with you. A lot of young ladies. Anyway, sorry. But my question goes to when you were talking about religion, and you talked about how we are the victims of religion. And I'm sure you do know about colonialism and how religion still is one of the major weapons that's being used for countries like ours. You said that you don't think religion should be abolished. And that's in the face of all the things that you talked about.
That's right.
So my question to you is, so what do we do? How do we get out of this? Thank you.
Okay, should we maybe take 2, 3, just because there's a little time, and then come back to you?
Okay.
2, 3 questions, yeah.
But we might forget.
Okay, all right, then go ahead. Go on.
All right. Yeah,
I was
we'll
going
just
to
do
take
one at a
notes,
time.
but it's fine. Go ahead.
I mean, that's a good question. If there's something that has kind of like problematic side effects, let's say, you know. But one of the real problems we do face is this idea of abolishing this and abolishing that. And abolishing one other thing is not going to actually solve our tendency to dictate and to be authoritarian. Why would you want to abolish something that is such a consolation and aid and comfort to people? What we have to do is find the space in which you can be you and I can be me, and nobody's killing anybody and nobody's forcing somebody to do things their own way. You know, so I think this is actually the how, I don't really know, but this is the urgent task that faces every nation. It faces the US, like you said, because there are people who are so fanatically Christian, and unfortunately, some of them are very close to the White House now, and will be from next year, who want to impose their ideas of Christian values on how I ought to live my life. That is intolerable to me, and I can fight those policies without wishing for them to believe any less in their God.
I mean, the essay you wrote in response to Trump's victory, which isn't in this book, but which I read, where you told the story of the drama about the rhinoceros, I believe. And I think you ended with a phrase from the main character who basically has resisted. Sorry. You basically talk about the main character who watched everybody become a rhinoceros, and he sort of resisted that. And the lines that you ended with is, "I'm not capitulating."
I'm not capitulating. Yes. You know, somebody asked me, said, well, you know, now that, you know, everything is going crazy in America, this was actually my editor in New York, who said, is it a little bit exciting to be caught up in, you know, this revolutionary moment where everybody has to be really brave and I said, no, there's no pleasure in it. There's no joy in it. You know, I did live here for 17 years, and under a succession of authoritarian governments, there's no romance in that kind of violence and repression at all. What you hope for is that when things like that come up, that you have the personal courage to do what you need to do, not capitulating. So this is a time, whether you're in Nigeria or in the US or elsewhere, this is a time to be a difficult person. If you were used to getting along, everybody liked you, well, you know what, that's past. Now you have to be a difficult person. You will make enemies, and it will be costly.
All right. Okay. Where's the mic? Yeah, this lady, and then we'll go to the middle. Yes. Yeah.
Good day, everybody. I wanted to comment about the jihad. Jihad in Islam doesn't mean bloodshed or fighting. It means freedom, equality, and justice. So the jihad of before is a jihad for justice, equality, and freedom. Not unlike the justice of now, of ISIS and Boko Haram. Secondly, in Islam, you don't force a person to become a Muslim because faith is in the heart. If you force a person to become a Muslim, he is not a Muslim because his heart is not in Islamic Avanna. So that is why Islam, the real jihad is fighting your own self, your own evil issues in yourself. That is jihad.
Okay, so
That's not a question,
can I
is
just,
it?
yeah, can I raise, there's this question that we keep sort of trying to grapple with, but we keep dodging, because I think there's a question of whether it's politically correct or not. And is this question of whether Islam in itself and the way it is structured today enables its appropriation by militant ideologies, and if Muslims have a responsibility to sort of look inwards and do the work that they need to do to be able to stop that sort of thing happening.
Perfect,
And this, yeah.
I think you've said it. That's it. It's like Teju said, it's not only in Islam that you find extremism, you know? So this is the concept. Here it is, this the way it's written in the book. But people would interpret it in their own way, you know? And that's why people have to be vigilant. Muslims have to be vigilant against the extremists. And that's why it's important, whether you're Christian or Muslim, to speak out when you see.
And is it a
this thing
task
being
primarily for Muslims because it is Islamic militancy, or is it, so this task of vigilance?
Islamist militancy, not Islamic militancy.
Well, so, okay. So
Islamist. So that's a decision there. It's not just.
And so I'm asking the question, this vigilance that you talk about, is it primarily there for the responsibility of Muslims, or is it the wider society?
The whole
In other
society.
words, should Muslims be expected to take more responsibility for what is going on or not?
I think first and foremost, you know, they should, because they understand it better. They understand how their religion is being twisted by virtue of being insiders themselves, you know? And then secondly, by the larger society, whenever you see something's getting out of hand, you know, you speak out, you do something about it. You don't just wait and just try to be too politically correct. You say something, because everybody's going to get affected at the end of the day, you know?
Any more questions? Okay. The gentleman with the white, yeah, right at the back. He's got white sleeves. Yes. Sir, can you stand up so they see you and give you the mic? Yes.
Thank you very much.
Can you stand up, please?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Chiri Zena. My question is slightly directed towards Helen. I've enjoyed reading your book. I've been following your work, and I think you're doing great. There's this part of this whole discussion of violence in Nigeria that has been restricted to just the Northeast. I'm reading a collection of essays by the Venerable Hajiya Biliku Yusuf, and she mentioned in one sentence genocide in Jos. I think if it's possible to also discuss that alongside the Chibok issue, I'll be very glad. Thank you.
Okay, so the question of, okay, we'll take one more question and then we'll come back to the panel. There's a young lady here in the middle with a white shirt. Right here. Yes. Hey, just here. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. Hi, Teju. My name is Laura Day from Brooklyn. Hello, how are you? So my question, when we speak about Boko Haram, and we talked on Ayodele's question about colonialism, every time we speak about Boko Haram, I don't really hear mention of the role that the U.S. State Department plays in this type of violence, that the CIA plays. WikiLeaks has released documentation about the U.S. government's role in instigating conflicts like what we have with Boko Haram. And as someone who has yet to read your book, I'm curious to see if this is something that you have grappled with or discussed in your work, and how that should play into our activities in challenging this tragedy. Thank you.
Okay. And I think, thank you. Just quickly to sum up, if you could deal with the first question, and then the second as well. The first is about violence generally in the country, and then of course you wrote about the white savior complex, where I think you deal with this issue. So that we can wrap up quickly. Maybe Helen?
Yeah, just to quickly address the question about the U.S. State Department and all that. I think during the Jonathan government, that was when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State. The U.S. didn't declare Boko Haram, foreign terrorist, FTO, foreign terrorist organization, because of certain implications. There really wasn't much cooperation from the Jonathan government, to work with these agencies, and they had to have that kind of cooperation for them to be able to do certain things. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which I cannot really go into. But I recommend certain books, and I must give props to Andrew Walker. You have to read his book. It's really, really, really good. It's not a lightweight book. It's really good.
I'm not going to hear the end of this, am I?
I couldn't resist. I'm sorry. Chiedu's question about the Jos thing. And I guess that's where you have the clear case of politics and religion kind of being politicized. This is a place that used to be one of the most peaceful places. I went to school there. And Nigerians would actually, Southerners would retire and go and live in Jos, just because of the peacefulness and the beauty of the place. Muslims were living there, Christians were living there. Then suddenly things kind of changed, I think you could trace it back to late 90s, I think, when you begin to have all the, if you go to Jos now, you won't recognize it. It's totally changed and it's totally it's shambles, basically. I don't have simple answers for that. It's just a tragedy, and it's these are the things that we see happening. Northeast, Jos, North Central. It's crazy.
Violence seems to be always bubbling just beneath the
There's
skin
always
in
that
this
tension.
country.
Yeah, it's always there.
Yeah, and Tejo, I think even in this book you dealt with the Alu 4, for example, the lynchings.
I mean, I think the bigger question of violence is definitely is one of my obsessions, actually. It keeps coming up in my writing and my work. Why do masses of people commit terrifying acts of violence? And I include governments in that. So you talk about violence bubbling beneath the surface, but we must not forget the violence that is always present above the surface, the violence of the state. to treat massacres as surprising acts of, sort of like a one-off kind of thing, is to take an unnecessarily naive view of the political structure of reality, which is that society at large, and I think this probably includes most people in this room, does not repudiate violence, actually. We recognize what we might think of as permissible or legitimate uses of deadly violence, which we either accept or tolerate. If the army says that, well, some people try to escape from some prison and we had to go in, and 400 people are dead, that disappears from Nigerian newspapers in like a week. But that is very, very serious. To me, that is as serious as if Boko Haram blows up a church or a UN building. But if you focus just on Boko Haram and you don't think about why is Buhari fine with the followers of some sect being mowed down, what are the forms of permission that we give to state-sponsored violence? We face the same thing in the US. The drones are doing their work. We don't want to know about it. They're fighting terrorists. So you killed 12 terrorists and 2,000 innocent people. You're fine with it because it's state-sponsored. You've been assured that it's all clean. All 4,000 of the people who died are not people you know. And then if somebody blows something up in New York, you'll say, why do they hate us? You can't be naive about it. You're like getting yourself ready for like a lifetime of surprises that should not be surprises. So I would sort of like, let me end on an optimistic note. I would hope that we could start having a serious question about what legitimizes violence. Do you condemn all violence, or do you simply condemn photogenic violence when it happens in the global capitals of the West, or to people who are presumed innocent and have not been labeled by your government for their own purposes?
Thank you very much, Helen Habila and Nejoko. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. It's nice to see a full house. Earlier, they all ran to listen to sex talk. And they disappeared. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I know I heard.
I'm just checking my app to my Ake Festival 2016 app to see what the next event will be. So we've got From the Land of the Flame Lily, new fiction from Zimbabwe. That's going to be happening in the chat room. So if you're going to see Tendai Huchu, Panashe, Chigumadzi, Noviolet Bulawayo, and Ranka, please go to the chat room now. Here we're going to be